Begin this hour with two different visions of the path forward for America. This week, President Trump remained stuck in the past, trying to relitigate an election he lost 6 years ago and spread election security conspiracies. But across the country, voters have more real-world concerns. MS Now's Alex Tabbitt spoke to some Trump voters in Iowa.
I want to hear where we're going. You know, I'm not all for that conversation at all. Get Iran figured out, get the economy, get gas prices back down.
Our economy, gas prices, it's every time he gets into office, he says he's going to help farmers. And now fertilizer prices are going way up because of events around the world.
And with that in mind, Democrats are trying to win over states, even in red states like Iowa, by focusing on the future and practical concerns. Former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg was in the Hawkeye State this week, holding events with Democratic candidates running for office there. And last night, he took his message to another red state, Florida, where he delivered the keynote speech at Florida's Democratic Party's Leadership Blue event.
They want you to think you're alone in your values and beliefs, especially when you're in a so-called red state, which is why I'm here to remind you that there is no such thing as a permanently red state.
And joining us now is former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Secretary Pete, thank you very much for coming to the weekend.
Thanks for having me on. Good to be with you.
It was great to see you back out doing what you do best, and that is talking to the American people. But I just want to start by just asking, this is our first time talking to you since the situation that happened with you and your family, and just checking in to see how you and Chasten and the kids are doing.
Yeah, thanks for asking. That false report really hurt our family, and something I wouldn't wish on anyone. But I also want to say the outpouring of love and support that we heard from around the country after that happened, not just from political allies, but even from people that I had competed or campaigned against, showed me that there really is a hunger in this country for a different kind of politics. And most, obviously not all, but the vast majority of us believe that there have to be some boundaries, have to be some rules, and there has to be a principle that whatever we're doing in our politics, you leave people's families out of it. So really appreciate all the expressions of support.
Yeah, we're very happy you guys are all doing well. You mentioned a different kind of politics, and you are someone who, for years, Democrats and Republicans have also had to admit, are one of the better communicators for the Democratic Party. You've been in Iowa with Rob Sand and Turk there. You're currently in Florida. When you're going to these, and I know you said there's no color for the states and districts, but when you go to these red states, what are you hearing from the excitement there? I talked to a lot of Iowa Democrats, and they're feeling better than they ever have. What do you think is percolating?
Yeah, there's extraordinary energy for change in a lot of these states. Right here in Florida, it's coming up on almost 30 years of one-party rule, and people realize that has not worked well for them. I think the politics of everyday life are connecting with the hunger for change in so many places, including these so-called red states. And I think part of my job is to remind Democrats in these states that they are not alone. They're not crazy to believe in the things they believe. There's actually a major, a powerful American majority, really super majority, around so many of our core beliefs, around the idea that one job ought to be enough, that everybody ought to have health care, that the wealthy are not paying their fair share in taxes, that we shouldn't be at war in Iran. These aren't just liberal beliefs or democratic beliefs. These are things most people believe, even in conservative areas. And it's why I think there's a real opportunity. I felt it on the ground in Iowa. I feel it on the ground in Florida. We were in Omaha, Nebraska, where I think Denise Powell can flip a House seat there. So many places where I think that big change is possible if, of course, we put in the work, which is why I'm traveling so much to try to be helpful.
Secretary Buttigieg, you mentioned the Iran war. I want to ask you about the 2 American service members that were killed when Iran attacked a base in Jordan. 1 service member is missing and 4 others required hospital hospitalization. What's your reaction to this news about these American service members that were killed? And what do you think is missing from the administration when it comes to the rationale for this war?
Well, first and foremost, heartbreak, knowing that two more service members gave their lives, knowing that there are two more families in America that are living that worst case scenario, that thing that when you're packing your bags for a war zone, I remember you visualize it, what it would be like if your loved ones were the ones to get the knock on that door, and that knock came, and really hoping against hope that this third service member identified as MIA is found and proves to be safe. By the way, there have also been hundreds of U.S. service members wounded in this war already, and so the cost is enormous. They are bearing the worst of the cost. And then in a different way, the whole country is bearing the cost because of what has happened to our economy, what is happening to the price of gas. And, we can't get a straight answer from this administration, even on whether a war is happening. The war is on again, off again. They say the war is over. The president recently said we achieved our war objectives, which raises the question of what we're doing out there. And, of course, the original objective was regime change. At least that's what he said at one point. That's not happening. So, I think this is one of the reasons why in many places that voted for this president, you're seeing a lot of doubt and an openness to running somebody or voting for somebody else, at least having people in Congress who can balance out an out-of-control administration. Because there are a lot of voters, depending on where they get their information, that when this president said he would keep us out of a war in Iran, they believed him. They see that that's not true, and they're looking for alternatives.
Secretary, then what should we do? What should the United States do now?
Well, the war has to come to an end, first and foremost. And the really frustrating thing is, any way you cut it, it feels like a best-case scenario is worse than the way things were before this war began. I remember one of the things that the U.S. is trying to achieve, which is an open Strait of Hormuz, was already the case before. And meanwhile, we have seen one Ayatollah Khamenei replaced by another Ayatollah Khamenei, no regime change either. So there's no great option here. But what's clear is this war needs to be brought to an end. And we need a U.S. government that is focused on stability abroad and affordability at home.
Secretary, let me get you on one more thing on the military. Secretary Hegseth announced on Wednesday a new policy to test troops for low testosterone. The screenings will be conducted annually as part of service members' required medical screenings for those 30 and older, he said. Troops under 30 can volunteer to be tested. Your reaction to that, and why do you think that the secretary, who has targeted transgender troops, all of a sudden feels that gender-affirming care for cisgender men is something that's required for the military?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's a problem of focus. And also, I think this may have more to do with the personal psychology of the secretary, that he's getting into hormone therapy. Look, every soldier ought to have, and a service member ought to have their medical needs looked after. Right now, we have seen an increase in communicable disease, including a base where a flu outbreak was a major problem, because you have the wrong focus. Look, I remember the experience that you'd have to do it every year when you're in uniform and you go through what felt like kind of a scavenger hunt going through medical, and they give you, all your immunizations, and they check your teeth, and it's just part of readiness. Here you have an administration, for ideological reasons, basically practicing the worst of internet conspiracy theory medicine in the way that they are changing and in many ways weakening and worsening the conditions for American troops' readiness. Troops need to be safe, they need to be protected, and they need to be healthy.
You mentioned focus. At the Secretary of State, Secretary of State Marco Rubio had a meeting this week with 60-plus different nations to talk about leftist violence, Antifa, as if it's this worldwide problem. But I also want to play for you Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House, and what he's been saying about leftists at this same summit.
The leftist is fundamentally motivated by envy, by hatred, by jealousy. The leftist looks at what is beautiful and what is good and what is natural and is filled with envy and hatred. To be blunt, not one of the people that is demonstrating looks like a normal person. Not one looks normal.
Your response to Stephen Miller and the White House trying to color all leftists as some kind of terrorism organization?
I'm going to resist the temptation to comment on the irony of his last remark and just bring it back to what are our officials doing? Are they trying to lead a country where people have different values and different political opinions, and the whole point is that we live together as one country? Or are they trying to demonize, dehumanize, and harm fellow Americans? Look, you can always rely on Stephen Miller to spout ideological gibberish at every opportunity. And he's part of an administration that came to power because a fair number of Americans believed them when they said they were going to make life in this country more affordable. And here you have inflation. You know, they were telling us last week to celebrate inflation numbers that show that the rate of inflation is higher than the day that Donald Trump took over from Joe Biden. It was about 3% then. It's 3.5% now. And they actually consider that good news because that's better than it was a couple of months earlier. This is what we're up against. And you've got top White House officials running around the world spouting ideological nonsense that makes it harder to get by at home and I think less stable around the world, too.